Hey guys, tonight we step back in time to one of the most unexpected jobs in ancient Rome, a job that was so essential, yet so unseen by most. We're talking about the fullers, the workers behind the scenes, responsible for maintaining the appearance of Rome's most prestigious citizens. But in ancient Rome, the art of cleaning was a lot more than just tossing your clothes in the wash. In a city where image was everything, a clean toga was almost as important as the man wearing it. Imagine a Roman senator in his fine toga, stained with sweat, dirt, or wine. Not a good look, right? But that's where the fullers came in, making sure every piece of clothing that entered their hands came out looking pristine and untouched by the grim realities of Roman streets. In fact, when we think about the rich and famous in ancient Rome, we often picture them lounging in luxurious villas, wearing togas made from the finest materials. But behind those togas, there was a team of fullers working tirelessly to keep the rich looking their best. Or were they seen as mere lowly workers, whose labor was important but whose status remained low in Roman society? How did these workers, who played such a pivotal role in maintaining the order and image of Rome, view their place in a world that looked down on their work? They operated in Phoeniciae, workshops dedicated to cleaning, dyeing, and maintaining the clothing of all social classes. For the Romans, clothing was a symbol of power and status. A clean toga meant you were worthy of respect and honor. Operating with such unorthodox tools and methods becomes so crucial to the functioning of an empire that prided itself on cleanliness, order, and public appearance. The fullers, in their strange yet vital work, helped shape the image of Roman society. Whether it was the toga of a senator or the tunic of a soldier, it was the fullers who ensured the garment was not only clean, but also symbolically important. It was a matter of life and death for your social standing. The fullers were tasked with maintaining the public image of the Romans, ensuring that the garments of senators, soldiers, and slaves alike were spotless and presentable. You probably don't think much about laundry, especially in the comfort of your modern home. At first glance, fullers might seem like humble laundry workers, but their impact on Roman society was huge. Their work was much more than simply washing clothes. The fullers were responsible for treating fabrics, removing stains, and often even bleaching the clothing to restore its original brilliance. Fullers often used urine, yes, you heard that right, urine, as part of their laundry process. It wasn't just used as a disinfectant. The ammonia in urine acted as a natural bleach, helping to break down stains and dirt. Fullers would collect urine from public latrines, sometimes even paying individuals to provide their waste, and use it to soak garments. They would mix the urine with water and soda ash, and then stomp on the clothes, much like pressing grapes for wine. This might sound ridiculous to us, but to the Romans, it was just part of the cleaning process. For the wealthiest citizens, who relied on their appearance to convey power, a dirty garment could cause serious embarrassment. And with the fullers on the job, these garments were brought back to their pristine condition, ready to send the message of wealth and status to everyone who saw them. Now, the process itself, well, that was not something anyone would call glamorous. In fact, it was downright bizarre by modern standards. And don't think for a second that this was just for the commoners. The elite used the fullers' services too. The significance of their job goes beyond cleaning clothes. But what about the fullers themselves? Were they regarded with the respect they deserved? As we dive deeper into the bizarre methods of Roman laundry, the question remains, how did these workers, now that we've introduced the role of the fullers and their essential place in Roman society, let us take a closer look at the process they used to get those luxurious togas and simple tunics looking immaculate. Spoiler alert, the methods were not just unusual, they were downright bizarre by modern standards. But as you walk home, the toga is stained with wine, dirt, and sweat from the summer heat. It's now no longer the perfect garment you once wore. You wouldn't dream of wearing it again until you've had it properly cleaned. That's where the fullers come in. Fullers would stomp on the fabric, using their feet in a ritualistic process that was crucial for softening the garments. After this, the garments would be spread out in the sun to dry. The fullers used strong bleaches made from soda ash mixed with lime. They would dip the fabric into this caustic solution, which helped whiten the material and make it look as fresh as new. This was especially important for the elite class, who wanted to present themselves as spotless and pristine in every social setting. But drying wasn't just about hanging the fabric on a line, it was another opportunity to enhance the final product. Well, soap as we know it didn't exist in ancient Rome. How did the fullers go from humble workers in small shops to becoming one of the most important trades in ancient Rome? And how did they manage the strange and foul-smelling substances they used daily, without revolting the very people they were serving? Instead, the Romans relied on alkaline substances and natural chemicals like urine and soda ash combined with physical labor. But the most surprising part of this process is how such a basic yet effective solution to cleaning was both widespread and accepted. Roman society was keenly aware of the importance of maintaining a clean public image, and the fullers' bizarre methods were an integral part of that. The bleaching process could sometimes result in the fabric being damaged, causing it to weaken or lose its shape. The fullers had to be experts in managing the chemical reactions, knowing just how long to leave the fabric in the solution to avoid ruining the precious garments. Fullers would often stretch the garments out and pull them to shape, ensuring that the cloth remained wrinkle-free. Stomping, much like in winemaking, helped to agitate the solution and break down stains. This was no delicate process. Fullers would stand ankle-deep in the foul-smelling vat, stepping on tunics, togas, and cloaks, sometimes for hours on end. This wasn't just laundry, it was a battle between man and fabric, with the fullers using their feet to reclaim the beauty of the cloth. The pressing of garments was important for ensuring that the clothes had that sharp, polished look that was so highly prized in Roman society. Fullers played a critical role in cleaning the military uniforms too. Roman soldiers, whose tunics and armor bore the marks of the grueling battles they fought, relied on fullers to keep their clothing intact. Fullers were also responsible for maintaining the sacred garments worn by priests, ensuring that these were always in pristine condition when used for rituals and ceremonies. The fuller's work was literally woven into the fabric of Roman society. The final product was a piece of clothing that not only looked clean, but was formally presentable, ready for the public eye. Picture it, you've just returned from a lavish banquet in the Forum, draped in your finest toga, with gold thread and intricate patterns. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. To really get the clothes clean, the Romans needed something far more unconventional. The secret ingredient, urine. Yes, urine was the fuller's greatest tool in the battle against stains and dirt. The first step in their laundry process involved soaking the clothes in a large vat of water. Mixed with alkaline substances, this was often soda ash and Fuller's earth, a type of clay. Ancient Romans, however, were far ahead of us when it came to recycling their waste. The fullers would collect urine from public latrines, sometimes even paying the poor to provide it, and then mix it into the large vats of water, using it to help loosen the stains from the garments. The reason was simple: ammonia, the chemical reaction between ammonia and dirt, oil, and stains was the key to breaking down the grime that clung to clothing. But it didn't stop there. After soaking the clothes in the mixture, the real work began. Once the clothes were sufficiently cleaned through this stomping process, they would then be rinsed thoroughly to remove any traces of the urine and chemicals. In addition to washing, fullers were also in charge of bleaching the clothes. But there was a catch. The process wasn't always perfect. After the clothes had dried, they would often be ironed using heavy metal implements, which were heated by placing them in hot coals or over fire. And yet, it wasn't just the elite Romans who used the fullers. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the Romans just use soap like we do today? With all this in mind, we have to ask, how did these unusual practices evolve? By now, we've explored how fullers played a vital role in Roman society, using bizarre techniques like stomping on clothes and vats of urine to clean garments. But there's more to their work than just laundry and public service. If you think it's odd that an emperor would impose a tax on urine, you wouldn't be alone. The Romans were incredibly advanced for their time in terms of sanitation. They constructed public baths, latrines, and complex sewer systems. But all of these systems required constant maintenance and, of course, financial support. The empire's vast population, particularly in Rome itself, meant that the demand for cleaning, bathing, and even laundry services was high. By taxing urine, Vespasian made a statement about the emperor's power to control even the most intimate and personal aspects of Roman life, and as a result, he effectively monetized waste. Some estimates suggest that the fullers alone, along with other trades that benefited from the use of urine, contributed a significant amount to the Roman economy by imposing a tax on something as unseen and ubiquitous as urine. Vespasian found a way to ensure that no stone or bodily waste was left unturned in the pursuit of financial gain, while the wealthy benefited from the services of the fullers. Did the average citizen resent the idea of paying a tax on something as personal and unpleasant as urine, or did they take pride in their work, knowing that their efforts were directly contributing to the upkeep of Roman society's standards? The question remains, in a society as grand and complex as Rome, how much of daily life was truly determined by power, politics, and the most unexpected sources of revenue? Moreover, what did the fullers themselves think of the fact that they were taxed for the very substance they relied upon for their livelihood? The fullers, for their part, were expected to pay the tax on the urine they collected, incorporating it into the cost of their laundry services. But who would pay for these vital services? The phrase became legendary, encapsulating the Roman perspective that money, no matter where it came from, was still valuable. The tax on urine, then, was more than just a means to generate income. It symbolized the empire's pragmatic, and at times cynical, approach to governance. It illustrated the Romans' ability to make use of even the most unpleasant aspects of daily life for the greater good of the empire. The fullers, whose work was often viewed with disgust, became integral players in the larger machinery of Roman society, enabling the elite to maintain their clean and pristine appearances while also contributing to the imperial coffers. At first glance, it seems strange, even ludicrous, that such a tax could hold any importance in an empire that was built on military conquests, grand architectural feats, and complex governance. Yet, in the context of the Roman economy, it was a brilliant stroke of practicality. Public latrines, often government-funded or operated, were collecting vast quantities of urine, which was then taxed and sold to the fullers and other industries. This was a brilliant way for the empire to raise funds without directly taxing the general public, in a way that would be immediately noticeable. The relationship between fullers, the Roman economy, and the practice of collecting urine goes even deeper than we first imagined. The Roman Empire, always keen on finding ways to extract revenue, made urine of all things a taxable commodity. By imposing a tax on urine collected from public latrines, he turned a foul-smelling byproduct into a valuable economic asset. In essence, urine became currency used for washing, bleaching, and cleaning, making the practice of urine collection not only a necessity, but a profitable endeavor. Enter the famous vectigal urinate tax on urine collection. It was introduced by none other than Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 CE. To understand why this tax was so significant, we need to take a step back and look at the Roman attitude toward public works and public hygiene. Vespasian, a shrewd ruler, saw a golden opportunity in the very waste that most people would turn up their noses at. The fullers were tasked with collecting and using urine in their laundry processes. But they were not the only ones benefiting from this odd arrangement. However, this wasn't just an economic issue, it was also a political statement. There's a famous anecdote about this very tax, where Vespasian is said to have held a coin up to his nose and remarked, "Pecunia non olet, money does not stink." Despite the odd nature of the tax, it was a source of significant revenue for the empire. But beyond the economic and political implications, the vectigal urinate also had a profound social impact. One must wonder, however, what did the common people of Rome think of this tax? Was there a sense of irony in the fact that fullers, who worked with such a dirty substance, were the ones responsible for ensuring that the elite's image remained pristine? As we look back at the fuller's strange, yet indispensable, role in the Roman world, the lanista, Roman gladiator trainers, the roar of the crowd, the clashing of swords, and the glint of steel under the scorching Roman sun. Gladiatorial combat was one of the most iconic and brutal spectacles in the ancient world. However, behind every fighter standing on the sands of the arena, there was a person who made it all possible, the lanista. In the grand amphitheaters of Rome, gladiators were the stars. But they were not born fighters. They were shaped, molded, and often broken by the hands of the lanista, the trainer and manager of gladiators. Gladiators were not just warriors, they were also entertainers, celebrities even. These men were often given little choice about becoming gladiators and were sent to the ludus, or gladiatorial school, where they lived under the strict discipline of their lanista. This meant long hours of intense training. They would practice with various weapons, learning how to fight using swords, shields, spears, and even the infamous tridents and net used by the dirtiest gladiator. They had to develop endurance, strength, and agility, as well as the technical skill to use these weapons effectively. Once inside the walls of the ludus, these fighters underwent grueling training regimes that tested their limits. Gladiatorial combat was not just about the fighters, it was also about politics. Despite the lanista's best efforts, some would break down mentally, while others might try to escape. The pressure to succeed in the arena was immense, and the mental toll on the gladiators was often overwhelming. It was the lanista's responsibility to ensure that his fighters remained motivated, and didn't he succumb to fear or despair. And then, of course, there was the constant threat of death in the arena. No matter how skilled or prepared a gladiator was, there was always the chance that they wouldn't survive. The lanista, despite his power and influence, had little control over the final outcome of the fight. The games were often staged to celebrate victories, commemorate special events, or entertain the elite of Roman society. Were they feared figures, wielding absolute power over the gladiators? Or were they simply pragmatic managers, doing whatever they had to do to keep the business of gladiatorial combat profitable? Was the lanista just a businessman? Or was there something more, something deeper that drove them to engage in such a grisly trade? How did they reconcile their role in one of the most brutal and inhumane spectacles in Roman society with their personal beliefs for the lanista? This meant navigating a complex web of political relationships. A good lanista knew how to please his wealthy patrons, securing the best possible fights for his gladiators and earning the favor of the powerful. The life of a lanista was one of immense pressure, filled with both rewards and risks. A successful lanista could become wealthy and influential, living in the lap of luxury while managing a stable of fierce, popular gladiators. Gladiators had to be prepared to face the fear of death, the uncertainty of combat, and the pressure to perform in front of thousands of spectators. The lanista, knowing that these men were often fighting for their lives, would also train their gladiators in mental toughness, instilling in them the belief that they could survive the brutality of the arena, but failure could result in financial ruin or disgrace. The gladiators under the lanista's command had to win, had to survive. Gladiators had to be kept in peak condition, for their survival was the lanista's livelihood. Injuries were common, and the lanista needed to ensure that any gladiator who was wounded in training or battle was properly cared for. Healing was as much a part of a gladiator's life as the fighting itself, and had to maintain their status as top-tier fighters in the eyes of the Roman public. A lanista was a businessman. They were responsible for organizing the fights, arranging matches, and even negotiating with promoters who sought to showcase their gladiators in the grand arenas. The lanista would be paid by the host of the games for each gladiator sent into combat, meaning that the more successful and popular their fighters were, the more money the lanista made. Success in the arena translated to financial gain, and the lanista's wealth was often tied to the performance and survival of his gladiators. Their fights were a form of public spectacle, designed to entertain, honor the gods, and showcase the power of the empire. The lanista's role was to ensure that the gladiators were not only prepared to fight but to perform. Fighting was a public event, and each gladiator had a persona to uphold. It was the lanista who would often decide how a gladiator would be presented to the public. Would they be the humble fighter, the daring rebel, or perhaps the stoic hero? The lanista played a key role in crafting this public image, shaping how the gladiators were perceived by the masses. These men, sometimes former gladiators themselves, were tasked with preparing the warriors for the arena, overseeing their training, and managing every aspect of their lives. They were part coach, part employer, and part psychologist, for they had to not only build the physical strength of their gladiators, but also shape their personas and mental fortitude. To understand the life of a lanista, we must first understand the role of the gladiator in Roman society. But how did the lanista balance all of these responsibilities? Training gladiators was an art in itself. Most gladiators were recruited from the lower classes, including slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. The lanista's primary goal was to make sure his fighters were physically capable of surviving and thriving in the arena. A gladiator's training was not only about physical prowess, it was also about mental resilience. The day-to-day life of a lanista was filled with the constant management of gladiators' health, from their diet to their physical therapy after training. But the life of a lanista wasn't just about training and managing fighters. It was also about the business of gladiatorial combat. Beyond the physical and financial aspects, the lanista also had to deal with the political ramifications of the games. But with all the rewards came the risks. Gladiators were, after all, human beings. But what about the lanistas themselves? And perhaps the most important question of all, how did a lanista handle the moral weight of managing men who were forced to fight for their lives? Gladiator training. Harsh realities. Imagine yourself in the scorching heat of the Roman sun, dressed in the light, rough tunic that marks you as one of the many who have entered the gladiatorial training school. Or ludus, your body is sore, stiff from the unrelenting hours of grueling practice. The scent of sweat, iron, and dust fills the air as you step into the training yard, surrounded by warriors from all walks of life, each preparing for their battle for survival. The lanista's role as a taskmaster was vital for producing gladiators who could hold their own in the fighting pits. But the lanista wasn't just a strict disciplinarian, he was a strategist. Gladiators were not all trained the same way. Instead, each fighter was prepared based on their specific fighting style. The lanista wanted gladiators who could fight with skill, not just brute force. Gladiators had to learn to manage fear, control anxiety, and maintain focus in the face of death. The lanista didn't just train them to fight, he also trained them to perform, to entertain the crowd, to hold their own in front of thousands of spectators. Gladiators were entertainers, and their job was to fight with flair, to create a spectacle. To become more than just warriors, they had to become heroes. So, they spent long hours practicing in duels with wooden swords and light shields, simulating the real thing. Training was often done with the knowledge that, one day, their skills would be tested for real in the arena. For those who survived long enough, they could become celebrities, admired by the crowds for their bravery, skill, and performance. Some gladiators even became wealthy, receiving rewards from sponsors or audiences. A victorious gladiator could win fame, a place in Roman society, and sometimes even their freedom. Unlike the gladiatorial matches we imagine today, glamorous and stylized fights were gritty, chaotic, and often fatal. The majority of gladiators would die in the arena, victims of the bloodthirsty crowds who craved bloodshed and drama. The question remains, though, how did these men manage to endure such a grueling existence? What drove them to continue training, day after day, knowing that the odds of surviving the arena were slim? Was it the hope of freedom, or the sense of camaraderie in the ludus, or simply the primal instinct to survive at all costs? A gladiator had no guarantee of survival, even if they were the best trained fighter in the ludus. And how much was driven by the brutal reality of the Roman spectacle itself? Death could come at any time, from a fatal blow or an unlucky move. These mock battles were intense, designed to test the fighter's endurance and reaction time. The life of a gladiator was anything but glamorous. In fact, it was downright brutal. Cuts, bruises, fractures, and dislocations were all part of the game. The lanista had to be a skilled medic too, capable of managing these injuries while still keeping the fighters in peak condition. The training was so intense that some gladiators broke under the pressure, either quitting or escaping. The life of a gladiator was fraught with risk not just from their opponents, but from the brutal demands of training. Others were taught to fight like retiree, armed only with a trident and a net, designed to entangle and incapacitate their opponents. They were subjected to mental games where the lanista would break them down emotionally before building them back up into the fierce warriors the empire needed. The entire system of gladiatorial training was based on the concept of survival. Every gladiator knew that the only way to escape the arena alive was to fight harder, faster, and smarter than their opponent. But this harsh environment was not just about making great fighters. It was about conditioning them for the greatest battle of all. Their inner battle. Gladiators would rise at the crack of dawn, their bodies already aching from the previous day's training. Their meals were hearty, often consisting of porridge, bread, beans, and vegetables. But more than anything, the gladiators were given a high-protein diet to build muscle mass. Meat, when available, was a crucial component. The diet was not about luxury, but about survival. They were fueled for their training so that they could train harder, longer, and ultimately face their opponents with physical might. A typical day began with conditioning exercises, running, weightlifting, and jumping drills to improve strength and agility. The gladiators were trained not just to survive, but to outlast their opponents. Then there were the Secutors, who were trained for high-speed combat, and the Thracians, skilled with curved swords, ideal for fast, slashing attacks. Each type of gladiator had their own specific set of techniques, and the lanista's job was to perfect those techniques, honing them for performance in the arena. The full-scale combat, the pressure to fight with skill and survival instincts, all began in the sweat-drenched training grounds overseen by the lanista, the trainer who was responsible for molding men into fighters capable of facing death in the arena. Gladiatorial training was not simply about learning to wield a sword. It was about building the mental resilience and physical endurance needed to survive in the most hostile environment of the Roman world. The arena, the training was relentless, no days off, no breaks. Some gladiators were trained to be Murmillo, heavy warriors who wore a gladius and large rectangular shield. The training regimen itself was intensely physical and carefully structured. Fighting was often done with blunt weapons in training. It wasn't about killing. It was about precision. Training was not just about physical strength, it was about learning the psychological aspects of combat. To achieve this, gladiators were often publicly humiliated to toughen them up. The diet of a gladiator was designed to maximize strength and endurance. But with all the physical and mental preparation came the injuries, and they were frequent. In addition to the physical toll, gladiators had to live with the constant fear of death. Yet, despite all the pain and danger, there was glory in the life of a gladiator. But for most, the reality was far less glamorous. As we delve further into the life of a gladiator, the question persists. How much of their fate was shaped by the relentless training of their lanista? In the heart of ancient Rome, gladiatorial combat was far more than just a brutal display of strength and skill. It was a business, a multifaceted, high-stakes enterprise that involved not just fighters, but financing, betting, and the intricate management of fighters, spectators, and sponsors. From the moment a lanista acquired gladiators to the final cheers of the crowd in the arena, the lanista had to manage every single aspect of the gladiatorial event, all while ensuring that it remained profitable. Gladiatorial combat was, after all, a public spectacle designed to entertain the masses and maintain social order through bloodletting. And at the center of this business was the lanista, the master businessman, who turned the spectacle of bloodshed into an economically thriving industry. These costs had to be covered, and often, the lanista found creative ways to maximize profits. Gladiatorial combat was, in many ways, an extension of Roman society's obsession with gambling. People would bet on the outcome of the fights, wagering money on which gladiator would emerge victorious. The lanista was adept at managing this betting system. While some bets were informal, others were heavily regulated, with official bookmakers organizing wagers on behalf of spectators. This often meant scouring the empire for fresh recruits, particularly those with natural talent or strength who could be molded into formidable fighters. Some Lanistas even sought out individuals who were already trained in other forms of combat, such as prisoners of war or skilled fighters from the provinces. A Lanista needed to keep his gladiators alive long enough to fight multiple battles, while also making sure they were physically capable of performing in front of a crowd. This required not just physical training, but also careful attention to their mental state. The more popular his gladiators, the more bets placed, the more spectators attended. The larger the portion of the profit would go to him. Managing the business of blood, he had created an industry that was as brutal as it was profitable. Was it simply about money, or was there something more personal at stake? Was the Lanista truly just a businessman, or was there a darker, more intimate side to the trade of gladiatorial combat? Yet, with all his skill in ensuring the gladiatorial games went off without a hitch, the Lanista always knew his greatest commodity was the fighter. And with every fighter who entered the arena, the risk of death loomed large not just for the gladiator, but for the Lanista's livelihood. Gladiatorial combat was a dangerous and sometimes deadly business, but for the Lanista, it was also an incredibly profitable one. Gladiators were investments, and the Lanista knew that a tired or discouraged fighter could hurt the reputation of his ludus, and ultimately, his profits. The more gladiators the Lanista could acquire, the better his chances of filling the arena with exciting, high-stakes fights. For example, tickets were sold to the general public, with a wide range of pricing based on seating and proximity to the action. Gladiators were often injured in training, and sometimes, even the most talented fighters could not guarantee a victory. The unpredictable nature of combat combined with the constant threat of death meant that the Lanista's investment in his gladiators was always fragile. The Lanista had to ensure that each gladiator put on a show for the audience. Their fights had to be thrilling, unpredictable, and deadly. The Lanista didn't just manage the fighters, he choreographed the entire event, making sure the combat flowed smoothly and kept the audience on the edge of their seats. It was a delicate balance between art, commerce, and bloodshed. To mitigate these risks, the Lanista often retrained fighters after each battle, keeping them in peak physical condition, but also ensuring they had the psychological endurance to endure the stress and trauma of the arena. When a fighter was particularly well-known or successful, betting would skyrocket, and the event would become even more lucrative. The Lanista could leverage these betting opportunities, publicizing the most promising or skilled fighters, in order to generate even more interest in the games. This created a cyclical effect. The more bets were placed, the higher the reward for the Lanista, which made the next event even more profitable. The spectacle wasn't just a display of power, it was a marketing strategy, designed to create anticipation, excitement, and ultimately, profit. The most prestigious and expensive seats were close to the arena, offering the best view of the bloodshed. These seats were often reserved for the elite, the very officials, senators, and aristocrats who would have sponsored the games in the first place. In this way, the Lanista created a hierarchical structure within the arena itself, ensuring that both the rich and the common people had a stake in the event. The Lanista's life wasn't just about training fighters to kill or be killed. It was about managing a complex web of relationships, finances, and logistics that ensured gladiatorial games were held regularly and successfully. By financing a grand, highly anticipated fight, they not only garnered respect from the people, but also secured votes or support for their future political ambitions. A Lanista, therefore, was not just a trainer, they were a negotiator, a liaison between the fighters and the powerful elites who funded the games. Gladiators didn't just fight for their freedom, they fought to keep the business going. And while the Lanista had a roster of gladiators under his command, he needed a constant influx of new talent to ensure the games never became stale. There were several ways the Lanista acquired new gladiators. Many were slaves, captured during wars or raids, who were forced into the brutal world of gladiatorial combat. Others were criminals, who were sent to the arena as punishment for their crimes. Yet, there were also the volunteers, individuals who chose to become gladiators for the fame, the potential wealth, or the promise of freedom if they survived long enough. Without the Lanista's skill in managing these relationships, there would be no games to fill the grand amphitheaters. But how did the Lanista manage this fine balance between sport and business? Let's begin with the financing of gladiatorial combat. Gladiators were not just randomly thrown into battle, they were part of a highly organized and planned event. Wealthy sponsors were often behind these events, funding the games in exchange for public admiration and political gain. A successful Lanista knew how to build connections with these powerful figures, ensuring that their gladiators were part of the most prestigious and profitable games. Often, these wealthy sponsors were public officials, magistrates, politicians, or even emperors who used gladiatorial games as a way to maintain their image and power. Gladiatorial games were expensive, requiring large sums of money for arena rentals, refreshments, and the care of the fighters. But there was another source of revenue that the Lanista was particularly skilled in managing: betting. For the Lanista, betting wasn't just an additional income, it was a way to raise the stakes. But as with all businesses, maintaining a steady supply of fighters was essential. The Lanista had to ensure that this supply of gladiators was constantly replenished. However, the Lanista's business was not without risks. One of the Lanista's greatest skills was managing the balance between the gladiators' physical health and their ability to fight. At the heart of it all was the spectacle. Gladiatorial games were not just fights, they were performances. By the end of the games, the Lanista's success was measured not just by the number of victories or the amount of blood spilled, but by the amount of money made. So as the crowds cheered and the gladiators fought for their lives, the Lanista stood at the center of it all. But here is the question: how did a Lanista reconcile the brutality of the business with the desire for profit? The Vestal Virgins, priestly duties, and the power of purity. And now, we step into the world of sacred fires, vows of chastity, and unwavering devotion to the gods. The Vestal Virgins, one of the most mysterious and powerful priesthoods in ancient Rome, were not just religious figures, they were symbols of purity, power, and protection for the Roman people. These women, chosen as children and sworn to a life of celibacy, held a unique place in Roman society, revered and protected as the embodiment of Roman virtue. But what did it mean to be a Vestal Virgin? And why did they hold such immense power within the very heart of Rome? Roman society, where family and lineage were paramount, revered purity above all else. To answer this, we must look deeper into Roman religion and the societal values that shaped the empire. Rome, in its early years, was constantly at war and in conflict, both externally and internally. The Vestal Virgins were not free to lead lives of their choosing. They were bound by rules that restricted their personal autonomy. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, worked alongside the Vestals in overseeing public rituals and ceremonies. Unlike other Roman women, who were often confined to the domestic sphere, the Vestals were treated as near equals to Roman men. They held seats of honor at public events, and their presence at official functions was a sign of Rome's divine favor. They were admired not just for their beauty, but for their dedication and sacrifice to the Roman state. The Vestals had the unique privilege of interceding with the gods on behalf of the state, and their prayers were believed to carry divine weight. They were also among the few women who had the right to own property, hold public office, and act as witnesses in legal matters. This autonomy, while limited, granted the Vestals a level of influence that most Roman women could only dream of. They could not marry, have children, or even leave the temple grounds without permission. Their personal lives were entirely dedicated to the goddess Vesta and the welfare of Rome. Their status came with tremendous pressure, and their freedom was severely restricted. How did these women reconcile the heavy burden of their duties with the personal sacrifices they were forced to make? Did they feel empowered by their role, or were they trapped in a system that exalted purity at the expense of personal happiness? While their position gave them social power, it also isolated them from the everyday life of Roman women, who typically found purpose and fulfillment in marriage and motherhood. Chastity and religious devotion reconciled the immense power granted to these women with the harshness of the vows they took. Was their strength derived from their purity, or was there something else that made them an indispensable part of Rome? As spiritual and political landscape, purity, in the Roman mind, was associated with stability and order. The Vestals, through their celibacy, represented the uncompromising commitment to maintaining the state's moral and spiritual order. They were believed to be under the special protection of Vesta herself, and their purity was a reflection of the purity of the Roman state. For the Vestals, their chastity was seen as a symbol of the city's purity and strength, but also due to their connection to the family of Rome. They were often called upon for rituals and ceremonies that would unite the Roman people. In moments of crisis or celebration, whether it was the founding of the city or the announcement of a new victory, the Vestals were present, offering prayers and ensuring the city's connection to the divine. To maintain the sacred fire of Vesta was a heavy responsibility, one that was directly tied to the survival and well-being of the state. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. A Vestal virgin who broke her vow of chastity either through infidelity or simply by neglecting her sacred duties was subjected to one of the most gruesome forms of punishment in Rome, burial alive. This horrific punishment was meant to reflect the seriousness of the Vestals' role in Roman society. They were not just religious figures, they were symbolic representations of Rome itself. To violate their vows was seen as a violation of the very soul of the city. Their most important role was the maintenance of the sacred fire of Vesta, a symbol of the city's vitality and safety. The Vestal virgins were chosen from the noble families of Rome, and the selection process itself was seen as both an honor and a tremendous sacrifice. At the age of 6 to 10 years, the girls were selected to serve in the Temple of Vesta, committing to a life of celibacy, obedience, and service for a period of 30 years. During this time, they were required to live by strict codes of conduct, and their actions were under constant scrutiny as long as the fire burned. The Romans believed that the city and its people would be protected from disaster, war, and famine. In this way, the Vestals held the fate of Rome in their hands. To extinguish the sacred fire was considered an ominous omen, a sign that disaster might befall the city. But there was much more to the Vestals than their role as caretakers of the fire. At the core of their duties was their vow of chastity, a commitment that granted them not just spiritual power, but also social and political influence. But why did Rome place such emphasis on the purity of these women? What was it about their chastity that made them so important? In many ways, the Vestals were elevated to a position that was above reproach, not just because of their religious duties, but alongside this reverence was the stark reality of their duties. The consequences for failing to uphold these vows were severe. However, the power of the Vestals went far beyond religious symbolism. These women held immense political influence. Their position as virgins also carried with it a distinct form of respect and reverence. Yet, despite all their privileges, the lives of the Vestal virgins were not without hardship. As we dive deeper into the lives of the Vestal virgins, one question remains. How did a society so obsessed with purity? The life of a Vestal virgin was not just about maintaining the sacred fire of Vesta. It was deeply entwined with the very rituals and ceremonies that kept the fabric of Roman society intact. These women held an incredibly important religious role, participating in sacred rites, public festivals, and ceremonies that connected the people of Rome to their gods. But their duties were far more than just symbolic. They were seen as vital acts that ensured the protection and prosperity of the city. The Vestals were the guardians of Rome's most sacred spaces, and the rituals they performed were believed to be the key to maintaining divine favor and ensuring the survival of the empire. They were also responsible for a number of rituals and ceremonies that were performed throughout the year. These ceremonies were meant to honor the gods, protect the city, and reaffirm Rome's divine power. Among these was the Vestal virgins' participation in public festivals, such as the Perilia and the Vestalia, the festival dedicated entirely to Vesta. At the center of their religious duties was the eternal flame of Vesta, which was to burn constantly, symbolizing the continuity and vitality of Rome itself. They were also responsible for protecting the sacred objects of Rome. If Rome was struck by a plague, famine, or any form of divine punishment, it was the responsibility of the Vestals to appease the gods and restore favor. they would perform purification rituals, which involved the use of sacred herbs, incense. The smallest infraction, such as breaking their vow of celibacy, was punishable by death, a brutal end that reflected the importance of their role in Roman society. Did they truly see their chastity as a form of empowerment, or were they simply trapped in a system that revered their purity at the expense of their personal freedom? Were the Vestals the epitome of Roman virtue, or did their roles leave them as prisoners of their sacred vows, forced to live lives of selflessness for the state? Despite this, the Vestals remained symbols of the highest virtue, representing the eternal strength of Rome. They were revered by all, yet burdened with a sacred duty that carried the weight of the empire's fate, and ritual sacrifices to cleanse the city of its impurities and bring it back into alignment with the divine. Their most important role in this was safeguarding the Sibylline books, which were prophetic texts that could only be consulted in times of great crisis. They were respected by all levels of society, even the emperor himself, and their presence at public events or ceremonies was a symbol of the city's connection to the gods. Although they lived a life of celibacy and vows of chastity, they were afforded special privileges. The Vestals were given the right to own property, make wills, and even enforce their own legal matters. In a society where women had few rights, this was a significant and rare power. They were often consulted for their advice, especially when it came to matters of state, and they were invited to attend official ceremonies alongside Rome's most powerful men. These books contained the wisdom of the gods and were kept in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. The Vestal virgins were responsible for ensuring that these books remained safe and intact, as the fate of Rome was said to be written within them. To violate the secrecy of these books, or allow them to be lost or destroyed, was an offense of the highest order. It was a time for the Roman people to come together in gratitude to Vesta for her protection of the city. During the Vestalia, the Vestal virgins would perform a number of sacred tasks. They would sweep the temple floors and prepare the sacred fire for the rituals. However, their most important act during the festival was offering sacred cakes to Vesta. These cakes, called molla salsa, were made from flour, salt, and water, and were offered to the goddess to secure her blessing for the coming year. These offerings symbolized the purification of Rome, ensuring that the city remained clean, pure, and under the protection of the gods. The Vestal's primary responsibility was to guard this fire, ensuring that it never went out. These prayers, uttered with solemnity and precision, were believed to be capable of securing divine protection for the city. Every word was important, every action sacred, as the Vestals understood that their prayers could either save or damn the Roman state. It was during these festivals that their position as mediators between the gods and the Roman people was most apparent. The fire was not just a religious symbol, but a political one. It represented the safety and prosperity of the state. The festival honored Pales, the goddess of sheep and flocks, and it was primarily concerned with agriculture and fertility. Although this festival was less centered on the Vestals than the Vestalia, they still played a key role in ensuring the spiritual well-being of the city. They would perform rites to ensure that crops and livestock flourished, and that the gods would bless the land for a bountiful harvest. If the fire were to go out, it was considered a bad omen, signaling that Rome was in danger of losing favor with the gods. For this reason, the Vestal's task was considered nothing less than life or death for the city. The ritual of tending to the sacred flame was a daily task that required the utmost care. The Vestals would enter the Temple of Vesta, a small and modest temple located in the heart of the Roman Forum, where the sacred flame was kept. The temple was the spiritual center of Rome, and its importance could not be overstated. The Vestal virgins would approach the altar with reverence, taking turns throughout the day to ensure the fire burned brightly. If the flame flickered or, heaven forbid, went out, it was the Vestal's responsibility to reignite it using sacred methods. To maintain the fire was not simply a matter of physical labor, it was an act of spiritual significance. The belief that this fire protected Rome imbued the daily task with a profound sense of responsibility. But the fire was just one aspect of the Vestal Virgin's sacred duties. The Vestalia, which took place each year from June 7th to June 15th, was one of the most important festivals in the Roman calendar. The Vestals were also tasked with performing sacred prayers during the Vestalia. The Perilia festival, which took place on April 21st, was another significant event in the Roman religious calendar. But the Vestal Virgin's duties weren't confined to only public festivals. Moreover, the Vestals were often called upon to conduct rituals of purification in times of national emergency. In addition to their sacred responsibilities, the Vestal Virgins were also highly involved in the social and political life of Rome. Yet, despite all their power and privilege, the Vestal Virgins' lives were heavily regulated. Their vows of chastity were absolute. The question remains, though, how did the Vestal Virgins reconcile their immense power with the sacrifices they made? The life of a Vestal Virgin was built upon the sacred foundation of purity, chastity being their most important vow. Their very existence was tied to the survival and prosperity of Rome. And their vow of celibacy was not just a personal sacrifice, it was a matter of divine importance. The Vestal Virgins were entrusted with maintaining the sacred fire of Vesta, performing rites, and ensuring that the gods favored Rome. To break this vow was seen as a direct affront to the gods, to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home, and to the very foundation of Roman society, to the Romans. The Vestals represented purity and order, and any violation of this sacred role was considered a cosmic disruption. According to Roman law, the culprit would be sentenced to a brutal death, burial alive. This ritualistic execution was considered not only a punishment for the woman, but also a ritual act, meant to restore the city as purity and appease the gods. The burial was a metaphor for the purification of the land. The tomb was not just a place for the physical death of the Vestal, but also a spiritual death that was intended to banish the impurity from the city. If a Vestal Virgin were to lose her chastity, it was believed that the spiritual well-being of Rome itself would be jeopardized. The fire of Vesta could be extinguished, and disaster would surely follow. The public nature of the event made it clear that the entire Roman world was involved in the act of purification. In Roman society, justice was not simply about restoring order, it was about sending a message. In Roman society, purity was linked to strength. Purity of the body, the soul, and the city was perceived as the bedrock of divine favor. While the Vestals were revered and their roles seen as powerful, the sanctions for breaking the vow were harsher than anything most other Roman women could imagine. While the Vestal Virgins were given privileges unknown to other Roman women, such as property rights and social status, their freedom was severely limited. Or were they simply Vestals of purity who were sacrificed in the name of Roman power and preservation? The punishment for breaking their vow tells us that purity was not just a virtue in Rome. It was the very foundation of the empire. If they broke their sacred vow, they faced the ultimate consequence, the loss of their life. Was this a moral absolution that came with their elevated status? Or did it highlight the paradoxical nature of their role in Roman society? In a world where purity was both a source of strength and a means of control, how did the Vestal Virgins truly perceive their place in a society that both revered and confined them? Women in Rome were often seen as the key to the survival of the household and the family line. And the Vestals, despite their privileges, were often kept in a perpetual state of control. The extreme punishment of burial alive seemed to reflect the value placed on purity in a way that no other Roman citizen could understand. The Vestal Virgins were expected to be more than just women. They were the custodians of Rome's very soul. Breaking the vow of chastity was seen as a permanent disruption to the spiritual harmony of the state. The gods would punish the city through natural disasters, plagues, or wars if the sacred fire went out or if the Vestals lost their purity. For the Romans, the Vestals represented the moral integrity of the entire empire, and to fail in their vows was to fail the very heart of Rome itself. The public nature of the execution of the Vestal Virgin was a reminder to the Roman people of the magnitude of purity, of the high price of betraying sacred oaths. For the Romans, the most important thing was that the purity of the Vestals was maintained at all costs, for the gods were always watching. Under Roman law, the chastity of the Vestals was protected by the state. The trial itself was often an event, as the Vestal Virgins were held in high esteem by the public. The trial could involve the most senior officials of Rome, with the Pontifex Maximus acting as the prosecutor, determining whether the sacred vow had been broken. If the evidence was deemed sufficient, the punishment was carried out swiftly. The Roman Senate, in collaboration with the Pontifex Maximus the high priest, would determine whether a Vestal Virgin had indeed violated her vow. This meant that public legal proceedings were held, but unlike most trials, these were rarely about the truth of the accusation. The Vestals were expected to guard their purity at all costs, and to betray the sacred responsibility was seen as a grave offense, even if the act was not fully witnessed. In return for this sacred duty, they were given privileges that set them apart from ordinary women in Roman society, including the right to own property, intervene in legal matters, and participate in political ceremonies and ritualistic punishments in ancient Rome, designed not just to punish the individual, but to restore cosmic balance and purify the city from the perceived taint. However, there was one transgression that was considered so grievous that it warranted the harshest of punishments: breaking the vow of chastity. The consequences for breaking their vow were not only severe, but also profoundly ritualistic. For this reason, the punishment for breaking the vow of chastity was one of the most severe, the ritual of punishment. Burial alive, the punishment for a Vestal Virgin who broke her vow was extreme and public. The condemned Vestal Virgin would be led to a special underground chamber, a tomb-like structure, often located in the Campus Celeratus, a site designated for the burial of those who had committed acts deemed unholy by Roman religious standards there. She would be sealed inside a small underground chamber where she would slowly suffocate. This method of execution was designed to reflect the gravity of her crime, a slow, suffocating death, symbolic of the spiritual poisoning she had inflicted upon Rome. The notion was that, just as the earth would consume her, so had she consumed the purity of the city. It was a terrible fate, one that reflected the deeply held belief that violating the chastity of a Vestal Virgin was a sacrilegious act that could not be allowed to go unpunished. The legal and public aspect of the punishment for breaking the vow, was not solely a religious matter, it had legal implications as well. While the official punishment for breaking the vow was the burial alive sentence, punishment was also a form of public spectacle. Yet, the punishment wasn't always just about the guilty individual. The Roman perspective on purity and consequence. The death sentence for a Vestal Virgin was seen as a necessary act for the continued survival of Rome. Interestingly, there was also a complicated cultural aspect to this punishment. This harsh punishment raised many questions about the role of women in ancient Rome. As we contemplate the lives of these remarkable women, one final thought arises. Were the Vestal Virgins truly empowered by their role? The Roman defecators, public toilet cleaners in the heart of ancient Rome, with its bustling streets, grandiose buildings, and monumental architecture, one might imagine the splendor and beauty that defined the city. However, beneath the grandeur, there were the everyday necessities that kept this sprawling metropolis alive. Among the most essential and perhaps the most underrated roles in the maintenance of Roman public life was that of the public toilet cleaner. But for the Romans, maintaining clean and functional latrines, public toilets, was not just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of public health and social order. Often considered a lower-class position, the latrinarius was tasked with a job that, though necessary, was gritty and unpleasant in many cases. These workers were provided with basic tools. Sponges, on sticks, for instance, were used to clean the surfaces of the toilets, while scoops and scrapers were used to manage the waste. Ancient Romans were not accustomed to the modern sanitation systems we take for granted today, and waste in public places could quickly become a source of noxious fumes. And yet, without these workers, the Roman public could not have enjoyed the public services they so often took for granted. Because the job was seen as so lowly, it was often performed by the poor, or in some cases, by slaves. And what did it mean for Roman society that such a vital aspect of city life, the management of waste, was left to those at the very bottom of the social hierarchy? It was a job that, despite its lowly nature, was absolutely essential to the survival and success of Rome. Without the latrinarius, the empire could not have thrived. But what did their roles say about the values of Roman society? How did they view the intersection of power, cleanliness, and class in a city where the rich and powerful lived side by side. With the most disenfranchised of society, there was little prestige associated with the role of the latrinarius. In fact, the job was viewed with a certain amount of disdain by higher social classes. Yet, in many ways, the work of the latrinarius was a vital part of the grand machinery that made Roman urban life possible. It is difficult to imagine a bustling city like ancient Rome functioning smoothly without such unsung heroes ensuring that the basic necessities of life such as waste disposal were taken care of. The importance of the latrinarius work was evident in the fact that Roman officials and the city government ensured the construction and maintenance of public latrines across the city. Their work supported not just hygiene, but also social cohesion. Public latrines were places where Romans from all walks of life, rich and poor, gathered in mutual need. Despite the lack of privacy, these latrines acted as social spaces where Romans could converse, exchange news, and conduct minor business transactions while fulfilling the most basic of human needs. The cleaner-est role thus extended to ensuring that the smell of waste didn't disrupt public life. Some latrines were equipped with perfumed oils or water sprays that would be applied during cleaning, keeping the air as bearable as possible. Public toilets may have been shared, but that didn't mean the Romans were willing to tolerate unbearable conditions. The tools might sound crude to modern sensibilities, but they were effective within the context of Roman society. In fact, the ancient Romans had surprisingly advanced techniques for managing waste. The sewer system, known as the Cloaca Maxima, was one of the marvels of Roman engineering, designed to carry away not just waste from the public latrines, but also water runoff from the streets. The latrinarius ensured that these sewer systems remained clear, so waste didn't overflow onto the streets of the city. Their responsibilities went beyond just cleaning the facilities. They had to ensure that the sewage systems which ran underneath these public latrines remained unblocked and operational. In many cases, the workers also had to manage the cesspools, which required frequent maintenance, to prevent the risk of overflow. Without proper sanitation, diseases could spread rapidly in the crowded urban environment, threatening the stability of the empire. The role of the latrinarius was not only practical, it was integral to the survival of Roman society. The cleaner ensured that public toilets were not only functional, but kept in a state of hygienic cleanliness. This was no small task given the open communal nature of Roman latrines. In the ancient world, public sanitation was a concern that reached far beyond the borders of Rome, and even by the Forum were large, open structures where people would gather to relieve themselves in a socially accepted manner. These toilets were often long benches with holes over a cesspool, making them little more than open pits. The idea of privacy was not part of Roman culture. When it came to such matters, people sat side by side, sometimes chatting and conducting business while tending to their natural needs. Despite this, the Romans still recognized that the sheer volume of human waste generated in these latrines posed a real challenge to public health. While other cities might have struggled with basic plumbing and hygiene, Rome, famous for its aqueducts, sewer systems, and public baths, had developed a sophisticated approach to managing human waste. Yet, with such large-scale infrastructure came the constant challenge of maintenance. This is where the public toilet cleaner, or latrinarius, came into play. It may seem like an unremarkable job to the modern mind. Roman public latrines, which could be found throughout the city and marketplaces, near bathhouses. Enter the latrinarius, the worker whose task was to keep these facilities in working order. Interestingly, the latrinarius did not carry out their duties alone. Beyond the mundane aspects of cleaning and maintenance, the latrinarius was often also responsible for minimizing unpleasant odors. The role of the latrinarius was largely underappreciated by contemporary society. However, these workers were often paid only a small wage for their unpleasant work. But how did the Roman elite reconcile their daily lives of luxury with the knowledge that their comfort depended on the labor of people in such lowly and unglamorous roles? As we explore further, it becomes clear that the work of the latrinarius was not just about cleaning toilets. It was about maintaining the sanitary foundation upon which the Roman Empire rested. Imagine stepping into the bustling streets of ancient Roma city alive with activity, commerce, and the echoes of grand architecture. Amidst the impressive monuments and public forums, a more mundane reality played out. These latrines, often located in the heart of busy districts like the Forum or near bathhouses, were long rows of stone or marble benches with holes cut out for sitting, allowing people to relieve themselves in a communal setting. They were connected to the city's advanced sewer system, which carried away human waste to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer. In the shadows of Roman society, behind the polished surfaces and marble facades, there was an essential but often overlooked job being performed: the maintenance of the public latrines. These tools, while crude by today's standards, were a testament to Roman ingenuity in the face of a complex problem: a simple wooden stick with a sea sponge attached at one end. This tool was used by both the public and the cleaners to wipe themselves after using the latrine. The sponges would be soaked in water or vinegar and then cleaned and reused by multiple people. After each use, the sponges were rinsed in a basin of water, which would likely be reused throughout the day. The vinegar acted as a disinfectant that could neutralize odors and reduce the spread of bacteria. These buckets were regularly emptied and refilled with water to keep the toilets functioning properly. They were also used to rinse the sponges and clean them sewage drains that were part of the latrine's infrastructure. In some instances, aromatic oils or herbal mixtures were employed to add a more pleasant scent to the air, although these were not always effective in a space as used as the public latrines. This was particularly important in the heat of summer, when the increased volume of waste made proper sanitation a constant concern. They also had to ensure that the drainage system was not blocked, as clogged drains could lead to overflowing waste or a foul smell permeating the surrounding area. Despite these efforts, the smell of waste would often linger in the air, a testament to the harsh realities of Roman public life. The practice may sound unhygienic to modern sensibilities, but in ancient Rome, this was the standard method of personal cleanliness. For the latrinari, their job involved regularly changing out the sponges, keeping them soaked in clean water or salt water in order to reduce the spread of bacteria. Each tool had its purpose in ensuring that the latrine stayed functional, clean, and odor-free as much as possible. They used metal scoops and scrapers, some of which were specially designed to dig out waste or clear blockages. These tools helped maintain the flow of waste through the latrine's drainage system, ensuring that the cesspools beneath the latrines did not overflow or cause foul smells. The odor from human waste, combined with the often cramped, wet environment, created an oppressive atmosphere. These would have been essential for removing smaller bits of waste and ensuring that the surface remained clean, in addition to sweeping the latrine benches. These tools were used to scrub the floors to prevent any buildup of grime and dirt, ensuring the space remained as clean as possible despite the inevitable waste that piled up. To make matters worse, high traffic in these latrines, combined with the lack of privacy, meant that these public spaces were constantly in need of attention. The men and women who kept these facilities cleaned the latrinari worked in an environment that most would have found repulsive, surrounded by the waste and filth of thousands of people. But despite the unpleasantness of their tasks, the latrinari were vital to Rome's daily life and public health. Rome's public latrines were marvels of engineering, but they were also social spaces where Romans of all social strata, wealthy senators, traders, and slaves alike gathered side by side. While the infrastructure of Roman latrines was state-of-the-art for its time, the latrinari, those tasked with cleaning the facilities, worked under difficult and unsanitary conditions. Tools of the trade. The latrinari's arsenal, despite the unpleasant nature of their job. The latrinari were equipped with a range of specialized tools that helped them maintain the sanitation of Rome's public latrines. Sponges on a stick. One of the most well-known and unique tools used by latrinari was the sponge on a stick. Scrapers and scoops, while the public latrines had drainage systems that removed waste from the benches, latrinari still had to scrape away debris that might clog the system or create unpleasant conditions. Brooms and brushes after the debris had been removed. Brooms made from twigs or brushes with stiff bristles were used to sweep out the interior of the Latrine. Vinegar and perfumes to combat the overwhelming stench that would build up in the latrines. The latrinari used vinegar and occasionally perfumed oils to mask the smell. Buckets and basins for latrinari working in particularly busy locations. Large buckets or basins filled with water were used to flush away waste and keep the area clean. Water supply and waste management. The latrinari also had the responsibility of ensuring that the public latrines had a continuous supply of fresh water. The work environment for the latrinari was far from ideal. The open latrines, often just stone benches or slabs over a cesspool, were frequently located in the busiest districts of Rome. Even though Roman engineering allowed for efficient waste disposal through their impressive sewer systems, the sheer amount of human waste produced by the population ensured that public latrines remained an unpleasant space. The smell of urine, human waste, and the overflowing cesspools must have been nearly unbearable for the workers who spent hours cleaning these facilities. Yet, despite the dirty conditions and low social status of their job, the latrinari were essential in preventing the spread of disease and keeping the city functioning. This meant that the cleaners worked under the constant scrutiny of the public, who used the latrines to relieve themselves and even socialize. Did the latrinari see themselves as indispensable to Roman society, or were they simply the invisible labor behind the spectacle that was ancient Rome? It was the invisible labor of those whose work was deemed too unpleasant, too lowly, and too unclean to be considered in the same light as the deeds of Rome's higher classes. The latrinari, the public toilet cleaners of ancient Rome, found themselves at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, despite their crucial role in keeping the city's sanitation systems running and ensuring public health. Unlike other workers who could take pride in their professions such as soldiers, artisans, or merchants, the latrinari were not seen as contributing to the cultural, intellectual, or military might of Rome. Romans held certain cleanliness rituals, sacred washing hands after eating, bathing before public events, and maintaining the sanctity of temples. Yet, when it came to public sanitation, the city relied on a class of workers who were viewed as unclean themselves. This contradiction was glaring. Romans valued cleanliness, but their system of public sanitation depended on those who worked with filth. The job was both necessary and disdained, a contradiction that created a deep tension between the respect for cleanliness and the devaluation of those who maintained it. Most latrinari were poor, and many were either slaves or freemen from the lower echelons of Roman society. While the latrinari were stigmatized by society, they were the backbone of the city's hygiene system. They held no political influence, and they were often seen as outsiders in a society that placed value on those who contributed to Rome's glory. They worked in the shadows, performing an essential public service while suffering from the public stigma associated with their task. Knowing that they were essential for Rome's survival, but remained hidden in the depths of the city? Were they ever able to take pride in their labor? Or were they simply resigned to the fact that their essential contributions would never be acknowledged in the public eye? Their labor was crucial to the survival of the city, yet the social recognition that accompanied higher positions such as soldiers, politicians, or engineers was denied them. In the eyes of society, they were simply unseen laborers, whose importance was overshadowed by the romanticized visions of Rome. Ironically, the workers who kept Rome's sanitation systems intact were the very ones that society sought to forget. In a world that celebrated public spectacle, the latrinari were invisible. They worked behind closed doors, their labor hidden from the public eye but essential to the survival of the empire. Without their work, Rome would have suffered from disease, overflowing cesspools, and unsanitary living conditions. The public latrines were integral to the Roman way of life, ensuring that the empire could grow and expand without the devastating effects of poor sanitation. Even with the stigma attached to their role, the latrinari were absolutely necessary for the continued prosperity of Rome. Being involved in sanitation work further entrenched them at the bottom of the social ladder. To work with waste was to be associated with the most undesirable aspects of life. For many, this role was as humiliating as it was necessary. It perpetuated a cycle of social invisibility where the workers were seen as indispensable but socially worthless. Their job was functional, yes, but not celebrated. They worked behind the scenes, keeping the city clean and sanitary, yet were completely overlooked in the eyes of society. In fact, little is known about the lives of the latrinari because there is so little in the historical record that acknowledges them directly. This anonymity reveals just how invisible and marginalized their work was. Unlike other jobs that were often pursued as a matter of personal choice or skill, sanitation was a necessity for the functioning of a large city like Rome. In fact, Roman society would have fallen apart without workers dedicated to maintaining the sanitary infrastructure. Disease, decay, and public health crises would have ravaged the city, and the empire's military might have even faltered without the cleanliness and health that allowed for a large, strong population to thrive. The latrinari, in essence, protected the health of the empire, yet they were never allowed to enjoy the social benefits or recognition of their work. With no privacy and no breaks from the constant flow of people, the job was both physically demanding and socially stigmatized. In addition to the uncomfortable physical environment, there was the stench of constant challenge. On one level, it stemmed from the inherent disgust that comes with handling human waste. Public latrines in Rome were used by thousands of people every day, from the emperor to the commoner. Everyone needed to relieve themselves. The waste generated was both inevitable and essential, but who was left to handle it? It was the latrinari who were forced to face public scorn for carrying out a job that was fundamentally important to the survival of the city. In a society where personal hygiene and purity were elevated to sacred standards, working with waste was an almost unthinkable task for those of higher status. Roman society had a deep reverence for purity, and the more noble an individual's work, the cleaner it was considered. Jobs that required physical contact with waste were viewed as ritually impure, a concept deeply rooted in Roman religious and social norms. The latrinari, therefore, were seen as ritually polluted. Their work was linked to the lowest, most degrading aspects of existence. The latrinari, however, were rarely acknowledged for their vital work. They were not celebrated in public life. Their actions were seen as invisible, their presence as little more than a necessary inconvenience. Despite their importance to the functioning of Rome, stigma surrounded them, and their job was considered unspeakably dirty, a role meant for the most disenfranchised members of society. Interestingly, the work environment of the latrinarius often meant that these cleaners were in close contact with the poor or those at the bottom of Roman society. Many latrinari were either slaves or free men from lower social classes, who lived in the most impoverished neighborhoods of Rome. As a result, these workers were often part of the invisible backbone that allowed the city to thrive. Despite their lack of recognition, the job of the latrinarius was dirty, uncomfortable, and socially unappealing. Yet, the role of these workers was vital to the survival of the city. Without their dedication, the public latrines would quickly have become unsanitary, hazardous, and a breeding ground for disease. In this way, the latrinari played a crucial role in maintaining public health and preventing the spread of illness that could have wiped out entire populations. But while the latrinari performed a dirty job that most Romans would never have wanted, they were unseen heroes who kept the gears of the Roman Empire turning. Their labor, although unseen by most, was integral to the very function of the city itself. So, while the work was unpleasant, the importance of the latrinari's role in Rome's public life cannot be overstated. How then did these workers view their role in a city that was so defined by its pride, splendor, and public image? In the grand tapestry of Roman society, where senators, generals, and philosophers were celebrated for their contributions to the empire's power, wealth, and culture, there existed an unspoken undercurrent of dirty secret that could not be ignored. While the grandeur of Rome's public baths, theaters, and temples garnered the admiration of foreign visitors and citizens alike, it was the latrines, those utilitarian spaces that dealt with the most basic of human needs, that ensured the survival of this great city. The social stigma attached to the job of a latrinarius was multifaceted. The role of the latrinarius was also severely undervalued due to its lowly status within the labor hierarchy. One of the reasons for this stigma also lay in the nature of Roman religious beliefs, the duality of necessity and disdain. The necessity of the latrinaries' work was undeniable, yet it was impossible to ignore the disdain that was associated with their labor. Interestingly, the latrinaries' work could not be considered optional. The disdain for the latrinari was compounded by their social class. Yet, it's crucial to note that the city of Rome itself depended on this labor. The paradox of power and powerlessness, despite the crucial nature of their work. The latrinari were also disempowered by their role. The role of the latrinarius, then, was one of paradox. They were both necessary and invisible, valued and despised. As we reflect on the lives of the latrinari, one final question arises. How did these workers cope with the stigmatization of their work? The Roman scribes, copying and transcribing ancient texts. In the bustling, chaotic streets of ancient Rome, where grand speeches were made in the Forum, and powerful men etched their names into history, there was a quiet, unheralded group of people whose labor ensured that the written word could be passed on through the generations, and rhetoric were central to both politics and social life. The written word was still an indispensable tool of power. However, not everyone in ancient Rome could read or write, and even fewer could afford to commission an educated scribe to craft documents for them. The scribes, then, were often the unsung heroes who ensured the survival of laws, literature, and personal communications. While their names rarely appeared in history books, their work had lasting effects on the continuity of Roman culture. These individuals were the Roman scribes, the people entrusted with the crucial task of copying, transcribing, and sometimes even forging important documents that shaped Roman society. The importance of these scribes was reflected in the role they played in maintaining the legal framework of Roman society. Roman laws, imperial decrees, and contracts were often written out and transcribed by these individuals, ensuring that the legal code was passed down from one generation to the next. In a world that was deeply classist, the work of the scribe was often relegated to the lowest rungs of society. Despite their importance, the scribes were rarely elevated to the level of artists or philosophers. Roman scribes relied on a variety of materials, and their workstations were often as basic as the task itself. Papyrus rolls were highly prized and could be quite expensive, making them ideal for writing official records, letters, and literary works. This material was used for more important documents, such as legal contracts, imperial decrees, and religious texts. Unlike papyrus, which could deteriorate over time, parchment was far more resistant to wear and tear, making it a preferred material for texts that needed to stand the test of time. The process of copying a single manuscript could take weeks or even months, depending on the size and complexity of the text. They might be employed in the service of the state or by local merchants, copying documents for a modest wage. For most scribes, the work was drudgery, and their social status did little to elevate their reputation. Despite this, their influence on the transmission of knowledge and culture cannot be overstated. Scribes worked long hours, often in poor lighting, with little rest. It was not uncommon for scribes to suffer from eye strain, back pain, and hand cramps as a result of their extended work. Despite the physical toll, the satisfaction of completing a manuscript was often the only reward for the scribe's labor. The ink used for writing was typically made from soot, water, and gum, creating a black liquid that was applied using a brush or reed pen. This allowed for more fluidity in writing and was better suited for long-form texts such as books and scrolls. The process of copying a document on papyrus was slow and painstaking. Each letter had to be formed precisely, with no room for error. The most common writing tool for Roman scribes was the stylus, a pointed instrument made from metal, bone, or wood that was used to carve letters into wax tablets. The stylus was used to etch the letters into the soft wax, and once the work was completed, the scribe could simply smooth the surface of the tablet to erase the text and reuse it. The scribe would spend hours hunched over these materials, carefully copying, transcribing, or sometimes even forging texts. The precision required for this work was immense, and the scribe had to ensure that every letter was clear and accurate. In some cases, scribes would even be tasked with embellishing the text, correcting errors, or even adding commentary in the margins. These wax tablets were incredibly practical, especially for making notes or drafts. Their names went unrecognized, and their work was often perceived as a mechanical task, something beneath the higher pursuits of statecraft and oratory. Even though scribes were instrumental in the creation and preservation of much of Rome's most sacred and revered documents, they lived in the shadows of Roman intellectual and political life. It was the scribe's pen that helped legitimize authority and ensure the continuity of the empire's legal system. The preservation of documents meant that laws could be enforced in far-flung parts of the empire, reinforcing imperial control over territories. In a world that placed immense value on oral traditions, where public speeches, they were frequently employed by philosophers, writers, and scholars to transcribe their works, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of Rome could be passed down through the ages. Roman scribes were responsible for copying philosophical treatises, poetic epics, and historical records, which were often circulated among the intellectual elites of the empire. Through their work, they helped ensure that intellectual traditions were maintained across generations, allowing Roman philosophy, rhetoric, and literature to remain alive for centuries. But what was it like to be a Roman scribe in a city that defined itself by its conquest of knowledge, its art of oration, and its love for the written word? What was their role in the transmission of ideas, the preservation of knowledge, and even the manipulation of power? These scribes often worked in the service of the elite government officials, aristocrats, philosophers, and scholars, or as private contractors who provided their transcription services to anyone willing to pay. The work of a scribe was grueling and time-consuming, as it involved more than simply copying texts word for word. Scribes were responsible for the accurate reproduction of the documents, and they needed to maintain a high level of precision. Scribes in ancient Rome were a varied group, ranging from enslaved individuals to free men who had mastered the art of writing. From the laws of the Senate to the poetry of Virgil, the scribes ensured that the written heritage of the Romans was preserved. Many scribes worked under the direct supervision of wealthy patrons, ensuring that the writings they copied were faithful to the originals. The life of a Roman scribe was shaped by the constant need to be vigilant, as their work involved reproducing texts that had lasting social, political, or legal significance. The role of the scribe in Roman society, the work of a Roman scribe, went beyond the mere copying of documents. They were the custodians of knowledge, often entrusted with preserving some of the most important texts in the empire. But beyond their work in the legal realm, scribes were also active in the preservation of literature and knowledge. Yet, the life of a scribe wasn't all about the noble pursuit of knowledge, the tools of the trade. To understand the work of a Roman scribe, we must delve into the tools they used in their everyday work. For more permanent writing, the scribe used papyrus, the primary medium for Roman manuscripts. Roman scribes also used parchment, a more durable and expensive material made from animal skins. In addition to these materials, ink pots, brushes, and quills were essential tools for any scribe. The life of a scribe, a grueling existence. The life of a Roman scribe was not just about sitting down to write. It was a grueling, monotonous task that required incredible focus and attention to detail. While some scribes enjoyed the privileges of working for elite patrons and enjoyed a modicum of respect for their craft, many others worked in more humble circumstances. The ancient world was a place where the written word held a mystical power, able to connect generations, convey laws, immortalize philosophical thoughts, and dictate the fate of entire empires. In a society like ancient Rome, where oratory and public speaking were elevated to the highest forms of communication, the task of writing was not merely a mechanical process. Long before the invention of the printing press, the act of copying a book or document was an exercise in endurance and technical proficiency. Unlike the ease we experience today with pen and paper, or the modern convenience of digital text, Roman scribes worked in a world of primitive tools, limited materials, and inexorable physical demands. It was an art, one that required an extraordinary level of skill, precision, and dedication. The scribe was more than a copier. They were a guardian of knowledge, ensuring that the written record of Roman life, whether in the form of laws, epic poems, philosophical texts, or personal letters, would survive the ravages of time. The scribe, the individual charged with transcribing, copying, and sometimes even forging texts was at the heart of this intricate process. Papyrus was used primarily for scrolls and books, and it was the preferred writing medium for more formal or important texts. Scribes wrote on papyrus using reed pens, which were sharpened at one end to create a fine nib that could hold ink. The scribe had to maintain consistent pressure when using the stylus or pen to ensure that the letters were perfectly formed and legible. Even small errors could be costly, requiring the scribe to start over or painstakingly correct the text. The ink itself was made from soot, water, and gum. This ink, while durable, was prone to smudging, meaning that scribes had to be particularly careful when writing. This meant that they had to squint and strain their eyes while transcribing texts for hours. The strain on the hand from holding the pen for long hours was a daily challenge. Some scribes may have suffered from carpal tunnel syndrome or similar conditions, which would have made writing even more uncomfortable. The lack of proper lighting led to eye fatigue and, in many cases, permanent damage to their vision. The scribe was not simply a mechanical copier. They were responsible for preserving the meaning and integrity of the text. Forgery was not unheard of in ancient Rome. Some scribes, particularly those working in government service, were tasked with forging documents to serve political or personal interests. The work of a scribe was never really celebrated, and their names were rarely immortalized. Yet, without their endless hours of labor, many of Rome's great texts would have been lost to time. The scribes ensured that the written legacy of Rome survived for centuries, and it is thanks to their work that much of Roman knowledge was passed down through the ages. The ability to disguise a forged document as an authentic piece of writing required an expert hand and a sharp mind. Forged letters of recommendation, official decrees, and even legal contracts could have been produced by unscrupulous scribes for personal gain. In many cases, these forged documents would pass as genuine a testament to the remarkable skill of the Roman scribe. As a result, many scribes became skilled in reading and decoding complex legal, philosophical, or literary works. They had to understand the text deeply, often interpreting it as they wrote. The intense focus required to ensure the accuracy of the text further strained the eyes. These tools were simple by modern standards, but in the context of ancient Rome, they were at the forefront of writing technology. Parchment was a far more durable material than papyrus, but it was also significantly more expensive. A scribe had to constantly focus on the accuracy of their transcription. Copying a single manuscript could take weeks, especially if it was a lengthy work or one filled with complex language or numerous corrections. Maintaining such precision over hours, days, and months was a test of mental fortitude. This material was often used for important legal documents, imperial decrees, and religious texts. Scribes would also require ink pots to hold their ink, which was carefully applied with the reed pen. Roman scribes did not have the luxury of typewriters or computers. Their tools were crude, yet effective. To be a Roman scribe was to possess an array of skills both mental and physical. Writing in ancient Rome was no small feat. The task of writing in ancient Rome wasn't just about transcribing the words of others that required the scribe to bring the text to life through careful calligraphy, attention to detail, and perfection. A scribe could easily spend hours at a time hunched over the writing surface. Whether it was a wax tablet, papyrus scroll, or parchment, this constant posture of leaning forward, holding the stylus or pen, and tracing each letter placed considerable strain on the scribe's body. These tablets, often referred to as tabulae, were rectangular in shape and coated with a layer of wax. This pain would have been exacerbated by the lack of proper seating or supportive furniture. Many scribes worked on hard floors or wooden benches, which would have been incredibly uncomfortable over long periods of time. The tension in their spines and necks was constant, and the act of writing became a battle not just for precision, but also for endurance. The stylus would carve letters into the soft wax, and when the work was completed, the wax could be smoothed out and rewritten. The ability to reuse these tablets was important for everyday writing needs, such as notes or short correspondence. However, for permanent records, the scribe would need to use a more durable medium. The The tools of the scribe. To understand the skill required to be a Roman scribe, we must first examine the tools they used. Stylus and wax tablets. The stylus, a pointed implement made from wood, metal, or bone, was the primary tool used for writing on wax tablets. Papyrus and reed pens for more long-lasting documents. Scribes relied on papyrus, a material made from the stem of the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly along the Nile. Parchment and ink pots for more formal documents or works that needed to be preserved for longer periods. Parchment made from the skin of animals was used. These tools required a high degree of dexterity and concentration. The physical strain of transcription. While we often think of writing as a mental exercise, the physical demands of being a scribe in ancient Rome were immense. Back and neck pain, the act of writing for long hours, required the scribe to remain in a bent posture, often leading to chronic back pain. Eye strain and poor lighting. Scribes often worked by candle light or oil lamps, as the natural light in Rome was not always sufficient. Hand cramping and repetitive motion injuries. The use of a stylus or reed pen required precision and speed, leading to repetitive movements that could cause cramping in the hands and wrist injuries. Over time, mental fatigue. The mental demands of being a scribe were equally exhausting. Challenges in transcribing and forging texts in addition to the physical strain. The scribe also faced the intellectual challenge of ensuring the accuracy of the texts they copied. However, the skill of the scribe also had a darker side. Despite the immense skill required for the job, it was often thankless. In ancient Rome, where law was not only a tool for governance, but the very foundation of Roman power, the scribe played a pivotal, albeit often invisible, role in ensuring the functioning of the empire. The Roman legal system was intricate and far-reaching, impacting every facet of society, from the highest senators to the lowest slaves. Roman law was not confined to a set of written statutes. It was a living, breathing entity, subject to the interpretation and adaptation of magistrates, jurists, and emperors. These individuals, often skilled in reading, writing, and legal language, were responsible for creating the written record of legal transactions. Their work was so vital to the Roman legal infrastructure that without them, the entire system would have collapsed. At the heart of this system lay a vast network of legal documents, including laws, contracts, imperial decrees, and court judgments, and sellers' names, the boundaries of the land, the price, and the specific terms of the agreement. These contracts had to be precise and legally sound to ensure that the parties' intentions were clear, and any future disputes could be resolved based on the written word. These documents formed the bedrock of Roman justice, ensuring that disputes were settled, contracts enforced, and punishments meted out. The language in these documents was formal, and often filled with legal jargon that only a trained scribe could handle. Roman courts, where disputes between citizens or between citizens and the state were settled, relied heavily on written records. These records were crucial for maintaining the consistency of legal rulings and for providing precedents for future cases. Roman law codes, such as the famous 12 Tables or the later Justinian Code, were preserved thanks to the work of these scribes, ensuring that future generations could access these foundational documents. It is through these efforts that Roman legal precedents survived the passage of time. Court hearings often involved orations by lawyers and magistrates, but the written record was what allowed for decisions to be revisited and enforced. A scribe's reputation and livelihood depended on their ability to create and preserve accurate records. A mistake in transcription could lead to legal disputes or challenges, and potentially even the invalidity of a contract or court ruling. Without their dedication to preserving and recording the written word, Roman law would have been lost to history, and the empire's legal system would not have been able to function as it did. Without them, the legal traditions that formed the foundation of many modern legal systems would be far less understood. Roman scribes were the silent stewards of a monumental legal tradition, ensuring that the rules of Rome would not only shape the empire, but also leave a legacy for the world. The work of the scribe ensured the survival of not just legal documents, but the very principles of Roman governance. In a society where written records could influence the fate of entire communities, The role of the scribe was central to maintaining order. Given the importance of these documents in maintaining the legal order, scribes had to work with the utmost care and attention. The scribe's legal expertise allowed them to ensure that the document complied with the requirements of Roman law. Initially, scribes were often slaves or freedmen, performing the grunt work of transcription and record-keeping for wealthy patrons or magistrates. Jurists, who studied and interpreted the law, would also rely on scribes to transcribe their work and create written copies of their opinions or legal treatises. As the Roman Empire expanded and as legal questions became more complex, scribes found themselves increasingly involved in the legal education and formation of future generations of Roman lawyers and jurists. However, as Roman law became more sophisticated and systematic, the need for legal professionals grew. Many scribes began to specialize in legal texts and become integral to the functioning of the Roman legal profession. When citizens entered into agreements, whether for the sale of property, a marriage contract, or the transfer of debts, these transactions had to be written down in order to be legally binding. Public notaries, a type of scribe with special training, were often employed to draft legal documents. They were seen as instrumental to the legal system, but their contributions were rarely acknowledged in the same way as those of the senators, magistrates, or lawyers. It is a reflection of the Roman attitude toward labor, where the work of scribes, despite being fundamental to the empire's survival, was considered humble and hidden from the spotlight. Legal archives were an essential part of Roman society, especially as the empire expanded and became more complex. These archives could contain everything, from property deeds and court rulings to imperial decrees. The scribes working in these archives ensured that all of these documents were carefully filed, organized, and, most importantly, legible. These scribes had to be well versed in Roman law, as they not only transcribed but also interpreted the legal intent of the parties involved. Legal documents in ancient Rome were typically written on papyrus, parchment, or wax tablets, materials that, while durable for their time, could easily deteriorate. The role of the scribe was thus not just to transcribe, but to preserve the integrity of Roman law. But how did these documents come into existence, and who ensured their preservation? However, without the scribe, much of the law would have existed only in oral traditions or ephemeral documents easily lost to time. The scribe's role in recording, transcribing, and preserving legal texts was central to the stability and continuity of Roman law. The Roman legal system was one of the empire's greatest achievements, influencing modern legal frameworks across the globe. The answer lies in the work of the scribes, the keepers of the written word, whose duties extended far beyond simple transcription, recording legal transactions, and court documents. One of the most important roles a scribe played in Roman society was in recording legal transactions. For example, the sale of land was not a simple exchange of goods. It involved a detailed contract that recorded. The buyer's scribes would be called upon to record witness statements, verbal agreements, and even oaths taken by parties to the agreement. In addition to drafting legal contracts, scribes also recorded court proceedings. The preservation of legal texts. Roman scribes were not only responsible for creating legal documents, they also ensured that these documents were preserved. Once a legal document was created, it was stored in archives or in the public registers, where it could be referenced in the future. Legal texts were often organized in books or scrolls, and scribes would meticulously copy and store these works. Importantly, the role of the scribe in the archives was not just to record, but to verify the authenticity of the documents. Scribes and the rise of legal professionals. Over time, the role of the scribe in Roman society evolved. Some scribes became lawyers or legal advisors, using their knowledge of the law and their expertise in writing to provide counsel to citizens. Or magistrates. Despite their growing influence, however, scribes remained at the bottom of the social ladder. The impact on Roman society and legacy. The importance of scribes in the Roman legal system cannot be overstated. Today, much of what we know about ancient Roman law and governance is preserved through the meticulous work of these unsung scribes. The Roman public executioners, a job with a dark side in ancient Rome, where power and justice were often intertwined with spectacle. One role stood at the heart of the paradox: the public executioner. It was a job that required a person to carry out the death sentences of criminals, slaves. One of the most public and severe forms of punishment was execution, and it was often carried out in the public arena, whether in the forum, at the circus, or in the Colosseum. It came with an uncomfortable truth: the individual tasked with carrying out the executions was often seen as one of the most despised figures in Roman society. While other officials might receive praise for maintaining the peace or administering justice, the executioner was condemned to a life of social exclusion, disgrace, and, ironically, a unique form of respect. The state-sanctioned killing of an individual was not only a means of punishment, but also an act of deterrence. Roman society had a deeply entrenched system of legal justice, governed by the belief that order and discipline were the pillars on which the empire stood. Public executions were a form of entertainment, used to demonstrate the power of the state and to remind the populace of the consequences of defying Roman authority. These events were often staged in theater-like settings, whether in the circus, the arena, or even in the forum, and attracted large crowds. The public nature of the execution was meant to instill fear and respect for the laws of Rome. While they were paid for their services, their work was considered so unholy that they were often excluded from society and forced to live on the margins. They were seen as ritually unclean, not only due to the violent nature of their work, but also because they handled death and blood on a daily basis. Executions were often highly spectacular events designed to invoke fear in the audience. The process of execution varied depending on the nature of the crime and the status of the condemned. It was seen as a cleaner and less degrading form of execution compared to crucifixion, and was typically carried out with a sword or axe. This savage display was not only a punishment for the condemned, but also a form of entertainment. For the Roman public, this method was considered more humane, but still carried the weight of public spectacle. Roman executioners were trained in the various methods of death they would be required to administer. While many may have entered the profession out of necessity, the reality of their work was likely deeply traumatizing. Yet, this desensitization did little to relieve the psychological toll of the job. Even the most stoic executioners may have been haunted by their role in the public spectacle of death. The knowledge that their work was socially marginalized and the weight of killing may have led many executioners to lead lives of loneliness and isolation. Executioners were required to look into the eyes of the condemned, hear their final words, and often see the fear and suffering of their victims, even though they were simply carrying out orders. The act of taking another life, especially in a public, brutal manner, would have left a psychological scar on the executioner. They had to be quick, efficient, and detached. Their job was to carry out the state's will, and they were expected to do so without hesitation or emotion. While slaves and common criminals were often subjected to the harshest forms of execution, noble individuals or high-status criminals could receive a quicker death, such as beheading, while others might face the more brutal spectacles of being thrown to wild animals or crucified. Executioners were usually banned from participating in religious ceremonies, and their presence was considered an omen of bad luck. The executioner would nail the condemned to a cross, leaving them to die in public. The agonizing death of the crucified was meant to send a clear message about the cost of rebellion and defiance against the state. It was also common for executioners to wear distinctive clothing, often to mark them as outsiders, so that they could be easily identified. It wasn't just about punishing criminals, it was about creating an atmosphere of control, where citizens could witness the brutal consequences of violating Roman law. They were the ones who physically enforced the verdicts handed down by judges and magistrates. Without them, the Roman system of punishment would have been incomplete. The executioner was the final link in the chain of Roman justice, the one who ensured that the ultimate punishment was carried out. As a result, the law often prescribed extreme forms of punishment for a wide variety of crimes, ranging from theft, treason, and murder to petty crimes and moral offenses, meant to demonstrate the power of Roman law and reaffirm the authority of the emperor and the state. While many officials in Rome held prestigious and powerful positions, The executioner was rarely viewed as anything other than a necessary evil. The position itself was often given to individuals from the lowest rungs of society, usually slaves, freedmen, or those with no other means of earning a living. These individuals were typically outsiders with little social standing, and their lives were often marked by the grim nature of their work and those who had fallen out of favor with the state. Yet this individual was simultaneously reviled and respected, feared, and necessary. The job of the Roman executioner was one defined by grimness, yet it played a critical role in upholding the imperial system of justice. Roman society was built on the idea of order, with a complex and codified legal system that prescribed punishments for a wide array of offenses. But while this practice of public execution was accepted as a part of life in ancient Rome, the role of the public executioner in Roman society was often paradoxical. They were necessary, yet hated, feared, yet respected. To truly understand the complexities of this position, one must explore the nature of punishment in Rome, the daily realities of the executioner, and the dark side of a job that came with the weight of death in its most brutal form. The Roman system of punishment. To fully comprehend the role of the executioner, it's important to consider the broader context of Roman punishment. Roman law also embraced the concept of punishment as spectacle. The role of the executioner in Roman society. The job of the Roman executioner was both a public duty and a personal curse. The social stigma surrounding the role of the executioner was profound. Yet, despite the social isolation and disdain they faced, Roman executioners held a crucial role in the functioning of the legal system. The nature of Roman executions were not only about death, they were a performance of public ritual meant to leave a lasting impression. Crucifixion, one of the most infamous forms of execution in Rome, crucifixion, was used for the most severe offenses, particularly for slaves and traitors. Beheading was often reserved for noblemen, or those who were seen as political enemies of the state. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Another form of execution involved throwing criminals to wild animals in the arena of spectacle. That was especially popular in the games held by emperors. Strangulation or hanging. Some criminals were strangled or hanged, though these methods were less common and often reserved for individuals of lower status. Regardless of the method, the execution was carried out with a certain degree of ritual. The psychological toll on the executioner, the mental strain of being an executioner in ancient Rome, cannot be overlooked. Some accounts suggest that Roman executioners could become desensitized over time, as they grew accustomed to seeing death and blood. The public executioner in ancient Rome occupied a position of great paradox. On one hand, the executioner was an essential part of the Roman legal system, tasked with carrying out death sentences, preserving order, and maintaining the empire's authority. On the other, they were deeply stigmatized, isolated from the social fabric, and forced to carry the emotional weight of their brutal work. It is easy to view the executioner as merely a tool of Roman justice, but in reality, their work carried a heavy emotional toll, affecting their psychology, reputation, and overall social status. The act of taking another life, even as a state-sanctioned role, was never a simple task. They were also forbidden from engaging in social or political life, as their participation would be considered a bad omen. This created an emotional burden for executioners, as they were often unable to form connections with others, whether friendships, family bonds, or even romantic relationships. The executioner's life was a lonely existence, marked by a sense of alienation and ostracism. The emotional cost of working as a public executioner was profound, and it would have shaped not only the executioner's own psyche, but also how they were perceived by society. The grief, guilt, and trauma they experienced were often hidden from view, as they were expected to carry out their work without showing remorse or hesitation, while the executioner was forced to take life on behalf of the Roman legal system. They often had to reconcile the state-sanctioned violence with their own personal morality. Was the executioner simply a tool of the state, or did they have a moral responsibility for the lives they took? The weight of this moral dilemma would have been ever present for those who performed the executions. The role of the executioner forced them to live in a constant state of moral ambiguity. where their personal identity was intertwined with violence and death. The psychological damage from years of performing executions could lead the executioner to view themselves as disposable or worthless, trapped in a cycle of violence and isolation. Over time, this lack of emotional outlet could have led to psychological deterioration, including anxiety, depression, despite their crucial role in maintaining the Roman legal system. Executioners were often forgotten in historical accounts. They were the invisible agents of death, the ones who carried out the state's will, yet they were rarely recognized or memorialized. This lack of recognition further reinforced the social alienation they experienced during their lives, as they were denied even a place in history. They were seen as instruments of death, rather than individuals with their own story or identity. While the victims of execution might be remembered for their crimes or their status, or the public spectacle of their death, the executioner was often reduced to the background, a faceless figure in the story of Roman justice, and even post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), though such diagnoses were not available in ancient times. These individuals were required to perform acts of extreme violence, yet they themselves were treated as less than human. The constant dehumanization of the executioner was an unfortunate consequence of the job. Executions were performed before crowds of spectators, who often cheered at the sight of a condemned person being slain in brutal fashion. These crowds were excited by the spectacle, but the executioner had to endure the constant pressure of performing in front of them. The cheers of the crowd could serve as a reminder of the executioner's isolation. They were always the outsider, the one who was responsible for ending the lives of others while the rest of society enjoyed the entertainment. They were isolated, stigmatized, and viewed by society as ritually unclean and immoral. This dehumanization went beyond mere social alienation and also created a form of self-degradation, where the executioner internalized their role as a killer and outsider. In this final section, we will explore the social alienation faced by executioners, the psychological burden of their work. Carrying out executions often in front of large, cheering crowds required the executioner to remain detached and emotionally numb. While some executioners may have become desensitized over time, the act of killing remained an unnatural and traumatic experience. Over time, the constant exposure to violence, death, and suffering would have likely led to deep emotional scars. The executioner was often forced to endure a moral conflict while they were fulfilling their role. As a servant of the state, they were also directly responsible for taking another life. The ability to end the life of another individual, sometimes without hesitation or remorse, was a learned behavior, one that demanded the executioner to disregard any empathy for the condemned. In a society that placed high value on honor, duty, and virtue, the person who administered death was viewed as inherently unclean, tainted, and unfit for regular society. This lack of social mobility meant that even if the executioner was skilled or talented in their craft, their role would still place them in a position of rejection and shame. Roman citizens often viewed them with contempt, and the stigma attached to their work made it difficult for them to form relationships with others. The physical act of execution was not only a public spectacle, but it also created a psychological rift between the executioner and the rest of society. While other officials enjoyed respect and status, executioners were social outcasts, who were kept at a distance from the everyday activities of Roman citizens, and the emotional consequences that came with being the one who delivered death to the condemned. The isolation of the executioner, unlike other roles in Roman society, the public executioner was isolated by both profession and reputation. The role of executioner was one that often fell to those from the lowest social strata, including slaves, freedmen, and individuals who had no other means of livelihood. Executioners were typically excluded from public religious ceremonies or other societal events, as the very act of handling death was seen as ritually impure, psychological trauma, and moral conflict. While the physical demands of the executioner's work were grueling, the psychological and emotional toll would have been far more profound. This emotional detachment came with its own set of psychological challenges. In many cases, the executioner's emotions would have been forced underground. The nature of their work also created a deep psychological paradox. The dehumanization of the executioner in Roman society. The role of the executioner was seen as inhuman. This dehumanizing effect likely had long-term consequences for the executioner's sense of self-worth. The public nature of the work only compounded the emotional burden. The legacy of the executioner, a job shrouded in silence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the executioner's job was that it left behind little legacy. In many ways, this silence around the executioner's legacy is a reflection of the emotional toll that the job imposed on those who performed it.